Today we turn our focus to Nigeria's asset recovery regime, a critical component in the fight against corruption and economic crimes. On Tuesday, the Nigerian Senate took a significant step toward reforming this regime by passing for second reading a bill that seeks to amend the Proceeds of Crime, Recovery and Management Act of 2022. The bill, sponsored by Senator Idiat Oluranti Adebule of Lagos West, proposes the establishment of a new centralized agency to manage assets and properties recovered from unlawful activities. Currently, 18 different agencies are responsible for both prosecuting cases and managing recovered assets, a situation critics say has led to overlapping functions, inefficiencies, and a lack of transparency. Senator Adebule argues that the proposed amendment will streamline operations, enhance accountability, and ensure better management of recovered assets in the national interest. So, what does this mean for Nigeria's broader anti-corruption efforts? How will a centralized system change the landscape of asset recovery? And what lessons can be drawn from past experiences? Well, joining us now to explore these questions and more is Dr. Umar Yakubu of Center for Fiscal Transparency and Public Integrity. It's good to have you join us, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, how would you assess Nigeria's current asset recovery framework? Has it been effective in reclaiming stolen or illicitly acquired assets?
Yeah, well, even the UNODC some years back, about 3 years ago, rated Nigeria very high in terms of asset recovery. But in asset recovery, there are different components. You have the external asset recovery and the domestic asset recovery, international asset recovery and domestic asset recovery. So in terms of the technical aspect, as well as the legal aspect, we are doing very well. The laws are strong. We now have the Proceeds of Crime Management and Recovery Act 2022, and it is doing really well because it has given a framework where you can effectively recover assets. But we need to do a lot more, because where our Nigerians are showing apprehension is in the area of what are those assets being used after they're being recovered. Because there's low level of information to the public of what the assets are being used for, you can see a lot of apprehension and questions that maybe assets are relooted again, because that's the dominant narrative out there. So that area is where we need to do a lot more. Then the second area we need to do a lot more is the domestic asset recovery. Yes, a lot of funds are being recovered, but a lot of assets too, in terms of property now. Let's say landed property, factories, houses, all of those things too need to be recovered, because the major component you see from the law enforcement agencies is the cash recoveries. But even though they are doing landed property as well, that needs to be developed much more, enhanced much more.
The EFCC recently handed over 700 housing units linked to the former CBN Governor Godwin Emefiele to the Ministry of Housing. What does it tell us about the state of Nigeria's asset recovery efforts?
Well, you can do the right thing in the wrong way. Legally, that was not appropriate to just hand over assets from EFCC to the Federal Ministry of Housing, if I'm correct. What the law says is that the EFCC should dispose of those assets and pay the proceeds to a consolidated revenue account. That's what the law says. If there are guidelines that guided that action, it should have come from the Ministry of Justice, who is supposed to be the coordinating agency for all issues that have to do with asset recovery. We are not aware of those guidelines. The civil society, we have not seen those guidelines. So from our own position, that action was actually illegal. The EFCC, ICPC, NDLA, and all law enforcement agencies, anti-corruption agencies, should have an internal mechanism for disposal of assets. You can't just wake up and say you have donated assets or given assets to another government agency without specified guidelines that should be open to the public in case they are available.
So what do we know about the total value of assets Nigeria has recovered in the last decade, and how transparent has the process been?
Yeah, right now, before 2022, it was quite weak. There's a lot of assets that were recovered, but you really don't know where the assets are. But let's not forget that in two categories. Assets could be the victim. The assets are usually returned to the victims. So it could be an individual or it could be government. So when it's government, you have to return those assets to the consolidated revenue account. But if it's the state, for example, the Chelsea Hotel, you return it to the state, the subnational level state. So, but the Act of 2022 actually consolidated all these problems. But there needs to be improvement in terms of transparency, in terms of release of information, proactive disclosure of information of how those assets, because if you pull the money back into the consolidated revenue account without weak mechanism, the money just filters away because nobody knows where the assets are being used. Nigerians want to see tangibles. For example, when the Abuja 2 or 3, you could say Kaduna Abuja Expressway, you could say Lagos Ibadan Expressway, you could say the third Niger Bridge. These are things Nigerians want to see. But when you take the funds and you just put it in an account and you don't say how the money is expended, there is bound to be suspicion that the assets are relooted. But if you really look at the process, it's difficult to reloot assets that have been recovered unless you put the monies back into the federal government account, then it's looted in that process, but not that the assets will be taken and stolen by any anti-corruption agency or law enforcement.
There has been a lot of buzz about the Senate's proposal to strip the EFCC and ICPC of their asset management powers and create a centralized asset recovery agency. What's your take on this? And do you think it's a step toward more transparency, or could it complicate things further?
Yeah, this is what happens when you have low level of transparency. If the Office of the Attorney General, who is supposed to be the coordinating agency, had done its work well in ensuring that there's effective coordination in terms of asset tracing and management and disposal, there would have been maybe no need for the Senate now to come and say they want to establish an individual in the agency to balloon our recurrent expenditure and create another agency. Because sometimes these politicians think the solving a problem is to create an agency. Now, they have not clearly understood that the problem is the weakness in coordination of all these things. The Ministry of Justice is supposed to have a database or a way of proactively disclosing information of how these processes are. They are also supposed to coordinate all these agencies. So when you don't have that, is the function, is the role. Because the agency, this is what they are actually supposed to do. Then the second element is of disposal. Well, that has been working individually within those agencies. So if it will actually make some sense, yes, for the disposal aspect, to give it to an individual body or agency, but they are doing it now with not consultants, with asset and disposal companies, which they do it and get their commission to them. So it's neither here or there, but we need to really evaluate what is the weakness in the coordination mechanism that will bring up where we can fill those gaps, not just rushing to create an agency, which may or may not be necessary.
Now, how does Nigeria compare to other African countries in terms of successful asset recovery? Can you make the comparison for us?
Also, that question is neither here or there, because if your asset recovery is high, what it means, the amount of your money laundering and illicit financial flows is high. So you are stealing much more, so you are recovering much more. So it's not positive or negative. So our asset recovery data is high, which means the money going out of Nigeria is higher. Because if you look at the data on illicit financial flows, out of every $50 billion per year, let's say in Africa, you hear 10 to 20 billion is Nigeria, meaning we're taking 25-30% of the bulk of Africa. So because what that means is that we must improve on our preventive mechanisms for the illicit financial flows and money laundering.
How cooperative have foreign governments been, especially those in Europe, the Middle East, and the US, in returning Nigeria's looted assets?
For me, I would say very low, because all you need to do is to go to the STAR Initiative Asset Recovery website of the World Bank. You can actually see a display map of how many assets has gone to outside Africa and how much has been returned back to Africa. You can see the correlation is very wide. A lot of assets, you see the dots in red, of all that have gone, but the amounts are not coming back. And this is because there are a lot of issues. It's very complex, a lot of lawyers involved, a lot of diplomacy involved to bring back those assets. So they will just not bring back our assets. Also, we have to take cognizance of the fact that there is low level of trust. There are times that assets have been returned and they have actually not been shown to be executed for the public. So these are all the issues we need to address to make sure that when you return our assets, we utilize it how we feel we should utilize it. But internally too, we need to clean up our system to ensure that when assets are returned, they are effectively utilized for people to see what they're being used for.
What would you say are the major legal or institutional bottlenecks hindering the speedy recovery of stolen assets in Nigeria?
Because jurisdiction issues, the countries have different laws, they have different mechanisms for asset recovery. Proving the assets are actually stolen is actually another hindrance, because the problem we have with our public officers here, when they steal assets from here and take it abroad, they have not declared it with the Code of Conduct Bureau. So once they go there, they are likely to even lose the asset if there's an investigation, because it has not been declared here. So how do you claim something that has not been declared? So in the long run, we just end up losing up the assets there. There are countries that use what we call the unexplained wealth order. All they need to do is just to activate or weaponize that law, and you have lost that asset, because we are not having a very strong asset declaration scheme in Nigeria where there's enough work being done to ensure that all public officers declare those assets.
All right. I must say a very big thank you to you, Dr. Umar Yakubu of the Center for Fiscal Transparency and Public Integrity, for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.
Express.